July 25, 1978. A small hospital in northern England. A baby girl takes her first breath, and the world changes forever. But this isn't just another birth. This is the moment humanity broke through one of nature's most fundamental barriers. This is the story of how three people, working in secret, facing ridicule from their peers and condemnation from the church, achieved what the entire scientific establishment said was impossible. This is the story of Louise Joy Brown, the world's first test tube baby, and the revolution that followed. For millions of couples around the world, the inability to conceive a child is a silent, devastating grief. In the 1970s, when 1 in 6 couples struggled with infertility, there was no hope, no treatment, no solution. You either accepted your fate, or you spent years, sometimes decades, watching everyone around you build the families you desperately wanted but could never have. The pain was invisible, the shame was crushing, and medicine had nothing to offer. Nothing, that is, until 2 British doctors decided that impossible just meant nobody had done it yet. Patrick Steptoe was a gynecologist working in Oldham, a mill town in the industrial north of England. He was not at a prestigious university. He was not surrounded by cutting-edge facilities or unlimited funding. He was a doctor in a district hospital, but he had mastered a technique that would prove essential. Using a laparoscope, a thin tube with a light and camera, he could see inside a woman's abdomen without major surgery. He could visualize the ovaries, identify follicles, and, with extraordinary precision, extract human eggs. This was groundbreaking work, but Steptoe knew that retrieving eggs was only half the puzzle. The other half required someone who understood the mysterious process of fertilization itself. Robert Edwards was a physiologist at Cambridge University, and he had spent years obsessing over a single question. Could a human egg be fertilized outside the human body? He had started with mice, then rabbits, then moved to human tissue. He studied the exact conditions needed for sperm to penetrate an egg. He experimented with temperature, nutrients, timing. He failed again and again. But Edwards was relentless. He understood that if you could fertilize an egg in a laboratory dish, and if that embryo could then be placed into a woman's womb, you could bypass damaged or blocked fallopian tubes entirely. You could give hope to millions. The scientific establishment thought he was wasting his time. The idea of creating human life in a petri dish seemed like science fiction, like playing God. Edwards didn't care what they thought. He cared about the science. When Steptoe and Edwards met at a conference in 1968, they recognized in each other something rare. A shared vision, a willingness to take risks, a belief that the impossible was just the difficult that nobody had yet achieved. They decided to work together, combining Steptoe's surgical skill with Edwards' laboratory expertise. What followed was nearly a decade of failure, frustration, and persistence that would have broken lesser men. They worked in secret, mostly. The Medical Research Council, Britain's main funding body for scientific research, had rejected Edwards' applications for funding. The committee called the work premature, ethically dubious, and unlikely to succeed. So Steptoe and Edwards scraped together money from private donors and pressed on. They set up their laboratory in Oldham, far from the academic spotlight, and began the painstaking work of trying to achieve fertilization and embryo development outside the womb. The challenges were immense. First, they had to retrieve eggs from women at exactly the right moment in their cycle, when the eggs were mature but before they were released. Timing was everything. Too early, and the egg wasn't ready. Too late, and it was gone. Steptoe would perform laparoscopy after laparoscopy, extracting eggs with a precision that bordered on art. Then those eggs had to be fertilized. Edwards would introduce sperm, then wait. Sometimes fertilization occurred. Sometimes it didn't. When it did, the next challenge began. Could the embryo divide? Could it develop into the cluster of cells that might, if everything went perfectly, implant in a womb and grow into a baby? They tried implanting embryos into women who had volunteered for the procedure, brave women who had spent years trying to conceive and were willing to be part of an experiment that might give them a child. The early attempts failed. The embryos didn't implant, or they implanted but didn't develop. Each failure was heartbreaking, not just for the doctors but for the women who had placed their hope in this radical new science. But Steptoe and Edwards kept meticulous records. They adjusted their techniques. They learned from every setback. By the mid-1970s, they had achieved fertilization consistently. They could grow embryos to the 8-cell stage, sometimes beyond. But implantation remained elusive. Month after month, Year after year, they would retrieve eggs, fertilize them, transfer embryos, and then wait for the phone call that never came. The call that would say, "It worked. She's pregnant." The call that would validate everything they had sacrificed. Then, in November 1977, something different happened. They were working with Lesley and John Brown, a couple from Bristol who had been trying to have a baby for 9 years. Lesley's fallopian tubes were blocked beyond repair. Natural conception was impossible for her. Steptoe retrieved an egg from Lesley's ovary. Edwards fertilized it with John's sperm in a small glass dish, not actually a test tube despite what the newspapers would later call it. The embryo began to divide. After 2.5 days, when it had reached the 8-cell stage, Steptoe carefully transferred it into Lesley's uterus. And then they waited. Days turned into weeks. Lesley Brown went home, trying not to hope too much, trying not to think about the countless disappointments that had come before. But inside her body, something extraordinary was happening. The embryo was implanting. Cells were dividing, multiplying, organizing themselves into the beginning of a human being. When the pregnancy test came back positive, Steptoe and Edwards hardly dared to believe it. They had seen false starts before, pregnancies that began but didn't continue. But this time, the pregnancy held. Week after week, the fetus grew. Lesley's belly swelled. The impossible was becoming real. But Steptoe and Edwards faced a new problem. If word got out that they had achieved a pregnancy through in-vitro fertilization, the media frenzy would be uncontrollable. The Catholic Church had already condemned their work as immoral, an offense against the natural order of creation. Ethicists were debating whether creating life in a laboratory was a dangerous step toward a dystopian future. The pressure on Lesley Brown would be enormous, and stress during pregnancy could lead to complications. So they made a decision. They would keep the pregnancy secret for as long as possible. Lesley would be monitored carefully, quietly. The world would find out when the baby was born, and not before. It wasn't easy to keep the secret. Lesley's doctor visits had to be carefully managed. She was advised to stay out of the public eye, to avoid questions from neighbors and acquaintances. Steptoe monitored her progress obsessively, checking for any sign of trouble. Edwards waited, reviewing data, preparing for what would happen after the birth. Because they both knew that if this baby was born healthy, everything would change. The scientific debate would be over. The technique would be proven, and millions of infertile couples around the world would have hope. As Lesley's due date approached, Steptoe made another crucial decision. The birth would happen by cesarean section, nearly 3 weeks early. He wanted to control every variable he could. He wanted the baby delivered in the safest possible way, with a full medical team standing by. On the evening of July 24, 1978, Lesley Brown was admitted to Oldham General Hospital. A small group of trusted medical staff was assembled. Security was tight. No one outside the hospital knew what was about to happen. Just before midnight, Steptoe began the cesarean section. The room was tense, silent except for the sound of medical equipment and quiet instructions. Then, at 11:47 p.m., Louise Joy Brown entered the world. She weighed 5 pounds, 12 ounces. She was healthy. She cried, a strong, clear cry that must have sounded to Steptoe and Edwards like the sweetest music they had ever heard. 10 years of work, hundreds of failures, countless hours of doubt and frustration. And now, in Patrick Steptoe's hands, was a living, breathing baby girl who should not, according to the scientific consensus of the time, have been possible. The next morning, the hospital issued a brief statement. A baby girl had been born through a new technique called in-vitro fertilization. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Newspapers around the world ran headlines about the miracle baby, the test tube baby, the baby born outside the womb. Reporters descended on Oldham. The hospital was besieged. Lesley and John Brown, who had simply wanted a child, found themselves at the center of a global media storm. Photographers offered enormous sums of money for pictures of Louise. Journalists camped outside the hospital. The Browns were overwhelmed, but they were also overjoyed. They had their daughter. After 9 years of heartbreak, they were finally parents. The reaction from the scientific and medical community was mixed. Some researchers congratulated Steptoe and Edwards, recognizing the achievement for what it was, a monumental breakthrough in reproductive medicine. But others were critical, even hostile. Some said the technique was too experimental, too risky. Others raised ethical concerns about the creation of embryos in laboratories. What would happen to unused embryos? Would this lead to genetic manipulation? Was Steptoe and Edwards opening a door that should have remained closed? The debate raged in medical journals, in newspapers, on television. The Catholic Church was unequivocal in its condemnation. The Vatican issued statements declaring that in vitro fertilization violated the dignity of human reproduction, that it separated the act of procreation from the marital union, and that it was morally unacceptable. Other religious leaders joined the criticism. Steptoe and Edwards were accused of playing God, of interfering with the natural order, of creating life in a way that was fundamentally wrong. The criticism stung, but Steptoe and Edwards had anticipated it. They had known from the beginning that their work would be controversial. They had proceeded anyway because they believed that the suffering of infertile couples was real and that medicine had an obligation to find solutions. And there was Louise, living proof that the technique worked. She was not a monster. She was not abnormal. She was a healthy, normal baby girl who smiled and cried and slept just like any other infant. As the months passed and Louise continued to thrive, some of the controversy began to die down. Steptoe and Edwards were invited to present their findings at medical conferences. Other researchers began to replicate their work. In 1980, Australia reported its first IVF baby. In 1981, the United States followed. The technique was spreading, improving, becoming more reliable. But the early days were still difficult. Success rates were low. For every pregnancy that resulted from IVF, there were many failures. The process was expensive, emotionally draining, and physically demanding for the women who underwent it. Egg retrieval required surgery. Hormone treatments caused side effects. And there was no guarantee of success. Couples would spend thousands of dollars, endure weeks of medical procedures, and still face the heartbreak of a negative pregnancy test. Some tried once and gave up. Others tried again and again, driven by a desperation that only those who have longed for a child can truly understand. Steptoe and Edwards continued their work, refining the technique, training other doctors, and advocating for better access to IVF treatment. They faced opposition from governments reluctant to fund what was still seen as experimental medicine. They faced criticism from those who believed that infertility was not a disease and that IVF was an unnecessary intervention. But they also received letters, thousands of letters, from grateful parents who had conceived through IVF, from children who existed because of their work, from families who had been made whole. Louise Brown grew up in the glare of publicity, but her parents did their best to give her a normal childhood. She went to school, played with friends, celebrated birthdays. She was, in every meaningful way, just like any other child. But she also carried a unique burden and a unique privilege. She was a symbol, living proof that science could overcome what nature had denied. As she grew older, she became an advocate for IVF, speaking publicly about her gratitude for the procedure that had given her life and her support for the millions of people around the world who needed access to fertility treatment. In the decades that followed Louise's birth, in vitro fertilization evolved from a controversial experiment into a standard medical procedure. The techniques improved dramatically. In the early days, eggs were retrieved through laparoscopy, a surgical procedure that required anesthesia and carried risks. By the mid-1980s, doctors had developed ultrasound-guided egg retrieval, a much simpler and safer procedure that could be done with minimal sedation. Success rates climbed. In the 1980s, only about 10% of IVF cycles resulted in a live birth. By the 2000s, that number had risen to 30 or 40%, depending on the age of the woman and other factors. New techniques emerged that made IVF even more powerful. Intracytoplasmic sperm injection, developed in the 1990s, allowed doctors to inject a single sperm directly into an egg, overcoming male infertility factors that had previously made conception impossible. Pre-implantation genetic testing allowed doctors to screen embryos for genetic disorders before transfer, giving couples the chance to avoid passing on devastating diseases. Embryo freezing became routine, meaning that unused embryos from one IVF cycle could be preserved and used later, reducing the need for repeated egg retrievals. By 2010, more than 4 million babies had been born worldwide through IVF. By 2020, that number had exceeded 8 million. Today, in some countries, 1 in every 50 babies is conceived through assisted reproductive technology. IVF has become so commonplace that many people forget how revolutionary it once was how fiercely it was opposed, how impossible it seemed. Robert Edwards lived to see his work vindicated in the most definitive way possible. In 2010, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the development of in-vitro fertilization. The Nobel Committee praised him for his persistence in the face of opposition, his scientific rigor, and his contribution to alleviating human suffering. Patrick Steptoe had died in 1988, and Nobel Prizes are not awarded posthumously, but Edwards made clear in his acceptance speech that the achievement belonged to both of them. He spoke about the couples they had helped, the children who existed because of their work, and the importance of pushing forward even when the world says something cannot be done. Edwards passed away in 2013, at the age of 87. By then, he had seen his experimental procedure become a cornerstone of modern medicine. He had seen the ethical debates evolve, the techniques improve, and the success rates soar. He had seen millions of families created through IVF, families that would never have existed without the work he and Steptoe had done in that small laboratory in Oldham. Louise Brown, meanwhile, went on to have children of her own, conceived naturally, a fact that delighted researchers and reassured anyone who still harbored concerns about the long-term health of IVF babies. Her son was born in 2006, and the event was celebrated as proof that IVF children were not just healthy but fully capable of natural reproduction. Louise's younger sister, Natalie Brown, was also conceived through IVF in 1982, making her the world's 40th test tube baby. Natalie was actually the first IVF baby to give birth, delivering a daughter naturally in 1999. The Brown family became a living testament to the success and safety of the procedure. But the story of IVF is not just about scientific achievement. It is also a story about the human desire for family, the lengths people will go to in order to have a child, and the ethical questions that arise when technology allows us to do things that were once impossible. The debates that began in 1978 have never entirely gone away. Questions about embryo selection, genetic modification, surrogacy, and the commercialization of fertility treatment continue to provoke strong opinions. Some people believe that IVF has been a pure good, a medical miracle that has brought joy to millions. Others worry about the commodification of human reproduction, the creation and destruction of embryos, and the potential for technology to be used in ways that are ethically troubling. What is undeniable is that Steptoe and Edwards changed the world. They took a problem that had caused immeasurable suffering and they solved it. They ignored the critics, endured the setbacks, and kept working until they succeeded. They gave hope to people who had none. They created a new branch of medicine. And they proved that the word impossible is often just a challenge waiting to be overcome. Today, fertility clinics exist in nearly every country. Techniques that seemed like science fiction in 1978 are now routine. Single women and same-sex couples can have biological children. Women can preserve their fertility by freezing eggs. Genetic diseases can be screened out before pregnancy even begins. The field continues to evolve, pushing boundaries, raising new questions, and helping more people build the families they dream of. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, share it with someone who loves history or science. Drop a comment and let us know what you think about the ethics of IVF, or tell us about other medical breakthroughs you would like us to cover. And if you are not already subscribed, hit that button now because we have more incredible stories like this one coming your way. Stories about the people who refused to accept limits, who changed the world through determination and brilliance, and who remind us that yesterday's impossible is often tomorrow's routine. Thanks for watching.